Hey everyone, I'm Jack with riverjackstudio, and in this video I enlist the help of my dad to make a gift box for a family friend's wedding, but we end up deciding it was too nice to give away. My dad had bought some zebra wood previously, and we wanted to make the box out of something more interesting than traditional monocolored wood like walnut or maple, so we decided to go ahead and cut up his piece. We didn't have enough zebra wood to make up the entire box, so we ended up cutting it into pieces in small sections, then turning the end grain up because it was streaked so darkly, and was a lot more interesting than the other profile. We would then alternate it with another wood type. I originally wanted to use a really dark wood to complement the very dark growth sections throughout the wood, but unfortunately the darkest thing we had was walnut, which was too brown and it didn't look good with the zebra wood. We ended up settling on a very dark piece of pit oak, and after sending it through the joiner and making sure the sides were flat, to send through the table saw. It was also cut into small strips to alternate with the zebra wood. They were cut at just over a ½ inch to give the top an eventual thickness of 1½ inch after planing. Then I set up my clamps to glue the strips of zebra wood and pit oak together using Type-On 3. If you watch the rest of my videos, you'll see a common theme throughout. I always use way more glue than I need, but I used to be stingy and sometimes my application would be pretty poor, so I wouldn't have squeeze out everywhere, which would have been prevented if I had just adopted my current method earlier, which is just to apply an insane amount of glue everywhere. Combined, the strips were just over 7 inches wide for the top of the box. After clamping everything up and letting it sit overnight, I came back the next day and undid all my clamps. I do try and wipe off as much excess glue as possible if I know I can't take that much material off the top when I'm flattening it, and in this case I couldn't because I needed to be right at ½ inch. I sent both sides through the planer and the top came out to be perfectly flat at just at ½ inch thick. I then went on and cut the sides of the box using the rest of the zebra wood. While the width would be 7 inches, the length would end up being around 11 inches, with the height of the box being about 5 inches. You can see the cool end grain pattern zebra wood presents, and we modeled the dimensions after a shoebox because we thought it was the perfect size to keep letters and postcards in as a sort of keepsake. My dad ended up cutting the final thickness of the zebra wood sides to ½ inch, just like we did with the strips on the top. Our neighbor came over at this point and said that zebra wood looked like a fancy plywood, which got a chuckle out of me, because it kind of does. The end grain pattern looks like the laminated pieces of plywood, and the face of the zebra wood does look like the laminated tops of plywood. That's what I should have ended up naming this video, was just Fancy Plywood Box. But I digress. We then sent the pieces through the planer to remove any of the table saw blade marks, and make sure we had a perfect thickness throughout, which would be important later on. I then grabbed my router box and jigged to make the finger joints for the edges. Continuing the theme of showing off the end grain of the zebra wood, we thought it'd be cool to utilize this pattern on the corners of the box as well, and give it a little bit more flair. I set up the rockler jig using a ½ inch wide mortising bit, set at, you guessed it, ½ inch height as well. I then used a test piece of plywood to make sure I had everything set up properly. I have never done box joints before, so this was a little nerve-wracking. You saw a 5-second clip of me doing it, but in reality I spent like an hour setting it up and going through about 5 or 6 different pieces of plywood to make sure it was all perfect. With a lot of small corrections and test pieces, I very reluctantly used a piece of zebra wood, which we had no extra of, so hopefully I didn't screw up anything. I then very carefully sent the first piece through, and after the first cut you just keep on sliding it over, reusing the previously mortised hole as the guide for the next one. And repeating that process all the way through, making sure not to do anything backwards when flipping the pieces over. I would then do the other side, making sure to match my starting point with the other side, and keep on going from there. This was honestly probably the hardest part of the whole build, due to me being dyslexic. I literally held my hands up until I was in middle school to figure out my left and right. So if my previous explanation sounds confusing, it's because it was for me as well. But I somehow managed to get through it and test fitted everything together, and it seems to have worked out pretty well, surprisingly enough. I then ended up smearing glue everywhere all over my joints using Type-On 3 again, and with a bit of caressing got all my joints together. I then put a ton of clamps on everything and ran a tape corner to corner to make sure that everything was square. And I made small little adjustments with the clamps, applying pressure to make sure that it came out to be a perfect box. I then let it sit for another day and came back and unclamped everything. I then took my top over to my miter saw and cut it a hair over 11 inches to get me the final size for the top. The top was now ready to be mounted, so I took my glue over and coated the top of my box, and then added the top to it by clamping it down evenly and making sure that it was squarely attached. Now at this point you might be asking, Jack, how do you plan on opening the top of the box when you literally just glued the thing shut? And that's a good question. But first I needed to cut off the excess box joints. Since they were a little over a ½ inch dimension, they protruded ever so slightly, and I didn't want to sand the edges down because I would risk pitting the sides and causing an uneven surface. So I made a jig to go over my table saw blade, and the edge of my guide would stick out just over the outside tip of my saw blade. I was then able to run it along the side of the jig and cut off the excess material flush with the box. The sides of my box were now flat, so I could now move on to cutting the top off my box. That's right, cut off what I just glued on. But instead of cutting it off right at the joint where I glued it, I would cut it right off at the end of the first box joint. So I would have a lip all the way around, which I could then use to center the lid on the box, with a lining that I would create later on. After cutting the top off, I needed a bottom, so I decided to grab a piece of podoke, cut 2 pieces to length, run them through my joiner and then the table saw to be able to glue them up. I then jointed the pieces together and let it sit for a day and came back, and even started to scrape off the excess glue in a couple passes through my planer. But then my dad came up and asked if the pieces were from the same chunk of podoke that the top was made out of. I said it was, and he said, was it from the opposite side? And honestly, I had no idea, so I said why. And he picked it up and laid it right next to the top, and lo and behold, it was nowhere near the same color. Fun fact, I am also severely colorblind, but even I could tell the difference on those 2 pieces. So back to square one we went. The color was way too off for me to use that piece, so I just decided to go ahead and put it on the scrap shelf. And I decided to cut off another piece of podoke, this side on the other side of the piece, so it was a closer color match. I then repeated my exact same steps over again and made sure that it was closer this time around. Am I surprised by this? Not even kind of. When I was younger, my mom would literally pick out my outfits for me because I would just wear black and brown or wear 2 shades of the same color. And I had no idea what I was doing because it all looked good to me. But funnily enough, my freshman year of college, a girl invited me to a sorority spring formal, which was apparently a pretty big deal because when I say this, and I can't reiterate it enough, she was a sorority girl who was apparently on some council setting the whole thing up. So she made sure to tell me 15 times at least to wear something nice. I told her not to worry and that I would make sure not to wear anything that would clash with her dress, and it also wouldn't be too matchy-matchy. Well, a week goes by, and this totally slipped back behind my mind. So the night before, she calls me, making sure that I'm all set and ready to pick her up the next day. And I was like, of course I am. No, don't worry about it. I got this. Well, as it turns out, I did, in fact, not have this because an hour before I was supposed to go pick her up the next day, I still didn't have an outfit picked out. And me being me, I had literally no idea what to wear. So, with some mild panic, I FaceTimed my mom and we went through my entire closet trying to find something that worked. And luckily I did. I then rushed over to her sorority in my sister's 2003 Toyota Corolla to pick her up. Shout out Mary Jane, appreciate you. Late, mind you, but we all can't be Prince Charming. She jumped in and the first thing she said was, well, I'm glad you weren't lying and that does match. So I told my date thanks. My mom picked it out for me and she laughed thinking I was joking. I was not joking. The formal ended up being a disaster and I very quickly lost my date, but at least my clothes matched. So anyway, back to the box. After the bottom was all prepped, I glued it to the underside of the box in the same manner I did with the top, having equal amounts of overhang on all sides. After that had set up, I then grabbed another piece of podoke and began cutting the 1/4 inch thick pieces to create the lining of the box. I made sure to use the same end piece of podoke to make sure my colors were close. I then set up my miter saw to 45 degrees and then cut my inside pieces to length. I first got the 2 longest pieces to fit inside nice and snug, and then I worked on getting the 2 end pieces to each slide in. The sides were just slightly proud to get the lid on. So I just ended up taking my tiny little block plane and went over each piece to make sure that the top would fit on nice and flush after I glued in these side pieces. I then pre-sanded everything to 120. Because I wouldn't be able to get my sander in later, I'd have to hand sand everything for the most part, so I just went ahead and made it easier on myself by doing this beforehand. I then grabbed my glue bottle and began smearing glue all over the insides of the box, and because the side pieces were so snug, I didn't want to try and glue the mitered edges, so instead of connecting it like it was a picture frame, I just went ahead and glued the backs, which would help prevent misalignment later on, while also being much stronger doing it this way. I then put almost every single clamp I had in my shop on this box to make sure the relatively thin lining pieces bonded to the inside of the box really well. I then cleaned up as much excess glue as possible so I would have less sanding later on. Since the lining had square edges and you had to perfectly place the top on the box to make sure it's seated, I decided to create a 45-ish degree edge on the side of the podoke pieces so that the top could be more easily guided onto the box. After that was fixed, I then turned my attention to the bottom and again used my flush cut router bit to cut off the excess, and so the finishing process begins. I first started sanding the outside starting at 80 grit and working my way up to 320. Same for the insides, except I would start at 120 because I had done some pre-sanding before. Hand sanding the insides took and felt like an eternity. A lot of elbow grease later, and I applied my finish, which is, in this case, Odie's oil. Just wipe on and wipe off. This box was so nice that my dad and I decided not to give it away, and instead give it to my mom to use. Since she has been my personal wardrobe stylist for years, and I really let her down by wearing exclusively stained and ripped work clothes the last couple of years, I decided she'd probably deserve it. Thanks for watching, everyone. My Etsy and all my other socials are linked below in the description. Feel free to buy something or go follow me on my other pages. It'd be appreciated. I'd also appreciate if you all like, commented, and subscribed for more woodworking content. Down in the comments, let me know if you all have ever bought or made something for someone else, but you liked it so much you just decided to keep it for yourself. See you all next week.